And now I do want to introduce our keynote speaker, who's Jose Gonzalez. And also, before I do that, just a reminder that on the right-hand side of your screen, the chat function, hope you guys can use that to chit-chat with each other. But if you do have questions that you want to pose to Jose as he's going through his presentation, please type those into the Q&A bar or the chat, either way, so that we can grab those and bring those in, and I'll be able to ask him those questions as we get to the end of his presentation. So, all right, Jose, welcome. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our conference today. Jose is the founder and director emeritus of Latino Outdoors, which is a national organization that's working to create a community of leaders in conservation and outdoor education, and striving to make the outdoors a safe and welcoming place for all. Jose is an experienced educator, having served as a K-12 public school teacher, an environmental and outdoor education advisor, and a university adjunct faculty. As a partner in the Avarna Group, his work focuses on equity and inclusion frameworks and practices in the environmental, outdoor, and conservation fields. He is also a talented illustrator and writer. Jose's commentary on diversity and environmental equity has been featured by many media and news sources. He is also engaged in collaborations with the White House Council on Environmental Quality, the U.S. Department of the Interior, and the National Park Service during the Obama administration, as well as with the Latino Conservation Alliance, the Next 100 Coalition, and California Parks Now. He has been recognized with several honors, including the National Wildlife Federation Environmental Educator Award, Grist Magazine Grist 50, and the Murie Center Spirit of the Muries Award, among others. And you should definitely check out his website and his amazing art and illustrations and poetry. Jose, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and welcome you. It is a super early morning for you in California, so welcome, and we're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Lori, and I appreciate that. I think it's worth it in many ways. So first of all, I want to say buenos dias and thank you all. My name is Jose Gonzalez, but full disclosure, full name is Jose Guadalupe Adonis Gonzalez Rosales, a bit of de Leon, he and his, and I'm greeting you all from ancestral traditional stolen lands of the Nisea and Maidu and Miwok, among others, in what is at the moment Sacramento, California. So that's why I'm a little earlier today, but I'm grateful to be here because a couple of the reasons. And to start off with, I think that my trips down to Texas have always been, they've always been memorable. And I think everything from one of my very first trips out to Hill Country several years ago to speak to a group of informal science educators. And so that began an introduction both to the ecological and kind of social landscape of the state. And then, of course, a lot of many wonderful nights of karaoke at places that I won't name. But if I see you out there, then that's another way in which we'll be able to connect. And I think what has been fascinating for me, obviously, in terms of the geography and landscape of Texas, is not just the sheer size, but obviously its ecological variety and diversity. Here's where I know I'm kind of speaking to the proverbial choir. This is what I understand. It's the work that you do to both protect and conserve the best of Texas. And I think that representation has always come through in all of my visits from one border to the others in a range of communities. And I think what part of why I'm here and what drives my work and where I see it connected and overlapping with what all of you do is obviously to understand how much of what we do and why we do it is embedded in this idea of protecting diversity. It's embedded in this idea that we want these spaces not just to be accessible, but to be cared by all as well. And therefore, that takes work and recognition of what is at hand so that we can continue to add to our conservation successes. And so, the landscape of Texas 100 years from now is going to rely on a very different set of demographics than the landscape of Texas 100 years ago. And so to ensure that that continues, it's to be able to undertake this work around diversity, equity, inclusion as an example. Part of that is, as I was mentioning, is the reality that no matter kind of how you look at a lot of the data, it's the fact that we're going to be increasingly a much more ethnically and racially diverse and representative country. And that's actually, it's a very good and exciting thing. As much as it is a challenge, it is an opportunity. And part of that work is recognizing that many of us are undertaking this with this type of intent and honor. And we need, all hands on board, so to speak. We need to be able to ensure that we're all collaboratively supporting each other and aligning with this respective work rather than relying on frames of deficiency, relying on frames of zero-sum that ultimately undermine our work as well. And in Texas specifically, this kind of mirrors a lot of what the national demographics are. And I think this is probably also representative in much areas of the West and the Midwest and West, where we're all working together to be able to protect and conserve so many of these landscapes. So again, that why we have all been engaged in our undertaking this work comes from a place of care, comes from a place of passion, and comes from a place of really love, both for the land and what is embedded in that, and that can spread across a range of communities. And then the other framing I provide on this is to be able to acknowledge that often when we talk about like diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's too easy to misunderstand, misinterpret it, or at worst, politicize it. And what I've learned in terms of my visits to Texas, that I think it's true in many, not just in other states of the country, but just in other countries, it's how different the people in terms of their care and community can be different from the politics. And so I say this not to shy away from that, but I think to be able to ensure that we honor the work that we do, and that a lot of kind of equity, inclusion, and justice-oriented work really lies at the bed to be able to recognize that as we continue to move to be a much more inclusive society, it recognizes that as the demographics change, it's acknowledging that that comes with changes in the decision-making spaces and who is elected and who represents us and who sits on boards and who leads organizations, and that having that be representative is a good thing. And it requires work because it requires us to acknowledge the challenge that have been there historically and systemically. It acknowledges the fact that, yes, we did actually have sets of laws that said that if you're one race or skin color, you can only access one door. You can only access one set of resources. And that doesn't change overnight just because the law changed. It requires our ongoing social, cultural, and social emotional work. And so to me, that's part of why I want to do this. So again, the Texas of 2050 and the Texas of 2100 continues to be a thriving place across the board because we are paying attention to that rather than relying on models of 1900 as an example. And that this work is hard. It's easy to kind of focus on, think of it kind of as an adaptability user curve. It is easy to kind of focus on those that already have a bought in, those that are already outdoors, those that already have a foot in conservation, so to speak. And it can be challenging to really think about how do we engage communities that seem to not be engaged and that maybe we think they don't care. But these intentional non-users have a range of reasons as to why they may be hesitant, as to why they have concerns, as to why they may not be there. And it doesn't automatically default to not caring. And I think that's an important thing. While we can look at data that says, so for example, this is from the Outdoor Foundation, we can look at data to be able to see how different communities are represented differently. Some communities continue to increase in their representation in outdoor recreation activities, for example, as demonstrated here. And we can look at, for example, this example and be able to note, oh, look, a Black demographic seems to be very underrepresented here. If we leave it to only translate that to mean a lack of caring or reasons as to why that is happening, we neglect the opportunity to be able to interrogate and investigate that further to better understand what is it about the way in which we frame things that we take for granted that can be seen very differently. And that's kind of the core of this work. As an example of this is from the 2017 Nature of American Studies that had a range of questions around nature and outdoors and recreation and conservation and environmental work. But here's an example, right? In terms of the question is, what is your interest in hiking? For the a lot category, this is why this is titled this way, interest in hiking lowest among Black adults. It shows it at 19%, so the lowest out of all of those. And again, you can look at this and think how this mirrors other data. However, if the question in this case for this survey was interest in walking outdoors, all of a sudden is quote unquote steady across race and ethnicity. And now you see that in this case, the Black demographic is up above 50%. So my question then becomes, what is the difference between hiking and walking outdoors? And so therefore, it leads me to think about a lot of not just the terminology that we use, but what is embedded culturally in that terminology and what is important to us about understanding how that can expand and be unpacked so that others can kind of be included in that and acknowledges that that changes the space, or conversely, how attached are we to some of these things that we may be inadvertently reinforcing, or at worst unintentionally or intentionally continue to separate our work from a lot of other people that actually do have interests and that they do show up and they do want to be involved, and that is borne out in a lot of other surveys as well. I'll continue with sharing a little bit more, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. So I'll just remind you all that if you've got some questions, comments, and ideas brewing, get ready to submit them so I can honor some of that time as well. So I share some of that to kind of paint a bit of the scope. I was thinking of kind of some examples, and so here's kind of like 5 considerations. Don't take these to be like, here are the 5, and then we're good to go. Always be aware of kind of a type of checklist mentality in terms of this work. But number 1 is thinking about how we can broaden our definitions of what outdoorsy and conservation means. That really, it's an invitation to think about the terms and the framing that define the culture of the work that we do, and to be able to think about how that can continue to change, to be reframed. Now that's important because again, sometimes people think that that is a zero sum type of change, like we're losing something rather than we're really expanding the space of power. Sometimes people might think that that's a loss of identity. I really think about how that is additive in terms of the identity. This is part of the founding of Latino Outdoors, to be able to say, hey, if there is a range of how I see in terms of a Latinx identity that can include Chicano, that it can include Hispano, that it can include people who won't even associate with those terms, but have some of that cultural heritage, how does that overlap with the range with the range of diversity of outdoor experiences? And to me, that's expansive rather than saying, hey, you should fit into this one notion of what it means to be outdoorsy, because then that lets you know that you're in. Second is conservation and outdoor leaders. For all of us here is to be aware about assumptions about a community are made and how to avoid them, especially as necessary, because the obstacles aren't just about cost in some cases. Cost is definitely a factor. Cost can be a factor in transportation, in terms of gear to access some of these spaces, in terms of passes, in terms, you name it. However, often a lot of the time is when a community really cares, they still show up. I often joke that within my own Latino community, when we have quinceañeras as an example, regardless of how much that costs, they find a way because it's important. So we will find all types of madrinos and padrinos because it's that important. If there is a way to ensure that we're supporting community, family, and relationship, it happens. So understanding how that value is transferred over and communicated, as well as that sense of welcome and invitation. I used to have a lot of families, and especially fathers, who would often say, sometimes they say, sometimes I just don't know what I can or can't do here. And so I don't want to get in trouble. But usually by that time, the ranger has shown up and is telling me I did something wrong. And so those kind of interactions can reinforce ideas about how a community is not included, right, or seen differently. It reinforces ideas around immigration enforcement. It reinforces idea about law enforcement. It reinforces idea about how a community is seen, as an example, because just by having Latino Hispano heritage, just like a Tejano heritage, doesn't mean that you are a recent immigrant as well, right? It erases a lot of the generational history that's there as well. So it's those types of examples. Um, Three different communities have played important but sometimes forgotten roles in the history of conservation. This is important because a lot of time this is unknown history. This is history that needs to be unearthed. It needs to be able to, we need to be able to look at and say, as much as we have conservation and environmental histories in the state and across the country, that has included a lot of different communities that aren't seen there. For my example, I often think about how the battle against DDT in the 1960s that resulted in a ban often leaves out a lot of the farm workers that were actually some of those initial plaintiffs in the lawsuits. And we remember, obviously, the importance and the value of protecting birds and raptors, as an example, but we continue to ignore and forget the farm workers. And then four, the conservation movement will need to continue its work on equity and inclusion in the context of social inequities and injustices. This can also, I understand, be a challenging one and a hard one because we think that a lot of quote unquote social justice work is out there. It's either it's out in the urban landscape or it's not in our ecological landscape, or that it's this type of kind of um, external or foreign language. And I often say this is important because these are the communities we need as constituents that will vote and support any of the ballot measures for preservation, for designation. These are the individuals that will show up to these places and understand why it's important to care for them and pass that legacy on as well. These are also the individuals that have suffered often from the very fact that so much of inequity has been grounded on land, around land. The fact that native communities were displaced, that this is stolen land for them, and conservation as a word brings up a lot of different imagery than how a lot of the conservation community uses it. It is a reminder that who has able to hold on to land and keep land and benefit off the private property of land, and have generational wealth to be able to have conservation easement, all of this has a history, right, that has impacted different communities differently. So in many ways, the conservation community is at the core of this work. And again, I see that as an opportunity rather than as a challenge of something to be afraid of. And then lastly, outdoor and conservation leaders can start by showcasing the value of experiencing nature to quote unquote underrepresented communities. There's a lot to unpack under underrepresented communities, but I think in terms of what I meant by the value is why is this just as valuable, if not more so, than buying tickets to Disneyland, than buying tickets to the movie? And this isn't meant to set them as an either or. What I'm getting at is just to be able to acknowledge that sometimes a family will put down the cost of some of those tickets because they have a value in them. That isn't just about the entertainment experience, but it's also about the social and experience, the family experience. And so understanding that this can also happen on conserved and protected lands is part of that work, and that it requires us to be open to also listening and hearing what that is that they're bringing in, rather than seeing this like a conversion type of component to be able to say, oh, we just need to convince them of what we like, rather than being open to hearing what do they like, to be able to understand how do we then co-create this space. And that's a very different way of looking at that shift. And so I share all of this because I know you're all undertaking a range of work. You're all at different places. You're all at different kind of starting points on this path work. Um, I share this kind of image right here because one of my very first kind of interactions to unpacking and understanding this work So this isn't a pop quiz. This isn't meant for you to like, oh, if you recognize this, then hooray. I know at least some of you do. This is kind of the beautiful Kastner range out there. But this is kind of like, right, that ongoing work. It's really to understand what does it mean to the value to the community, that you have to be able to unpack that process. You can't just do it as you did it before. And so I've always appreciated that work, and we'll give them a shout out in terms of kind of protect the Kastner range, because I think that can be an example that A, models that it's not easy, B, that it takes a lot of work, and then C, if you can't ground it in community, then part of that question is, then why are we doing this? But I also want to close this out in here because part of my work is to understand that often we will engage with this and then begin to see and be exposed and engage and interact with a lot of terms that are heavy, a lot of terms that carry a lot of harm, a lot of terms that can be triggering and reactionary to a lot of different people. To me, part of this work is to understand how to engage with the fluency in the same way that we engage with the fluency of a lot of our conservation terminology, to try to unpack it and understand so that we are less complicit with it and we are more proactive in undoing some of this. Because if this carries forth, it will undo our conservation work. And this is also not a binary. That's always beware of the binary to say something's automatically good and automatically bad. There can be such things as what are just and unjust. However, for me, I'd like to approach this at minimum to understand the conversations that are happening so I'm best and better prepared to be able to engage in them. And that's very different than the positions we stake within those conversations compared to the interests that we want to explore. Because by part of this, by understanding that, oh no, if we're going to talk about colonization and now I don't feel good because I'm being told that I'm a colonizer, I really look at that to be able to say, how do I approach conservation work? Have I examined that and then realized that maybe the way that I talk about it or the way that I learned about it was overly mechanistic and reductionist? Right? We're protecting the landscape as if I am a savior in some component. Um, am I protecting the landscape and only I'm getting quantitative measurements of the health of the ecosystem? And that completely shuts out maybe an indigenous or ancestral view or frame of the land. And if I'm open to that, that becomes an opportunity to ensure that that community understands that you're at least aware and open of how to approach this differently. Because a lot of how this work is to kind of unpack it allows us to kind of flip it into a life honoring logic, a life affirming logic, a life honoring worldview. But guess what? It's grounded so much in our ecological language that we use to be able to value and protect landscapes. When we look out at a protected landscape, I know very few people that say, "Oh, that's a beautiful monoculture of a forest." I really like the way that the wildflowers are all growing in a uniform way. Um, right? We understand the value of diversity in an ecological landscape. So being able to say, how does that transfer over to how we value and engage with a social one? And so a lot of this for me has been important to also reconnect with the idea that what we do in conservation, what we do in the protection and stewardship uh, of these lands is embedded in this, and it transfer over to a lot of the hard work that happens. A key example for that for me is this image that's hard. It's an image that's challenging and representative of last year, especially for me in California, to understand that wildfires are very destructive. But if that means that I automatically see fire as bad, that um, takes away, right? It takes away from the opportunity to understand the value of fire, especially to a fire adapted ecosystem and landscape. And that it isn't the land's fault. And sometimes it isn't even the fire's fault. It is understanding that our past practices of over suppression, of overly labeling all fire as bad, set up a tinderbox to where it is more intense and destructive. And we kind of ignore the value of prescriptive burning. We're relearning that, something that was already there present in many indigenous communities. And so if we're not careful, then we end up with a situation like this. right? We end up with all of the harm. And we don't end up being able to set up the landscapes for healthy succession. Right? And again, these are things that we understand kind of in the ecological sense. For me, then I transfer these questions into the social landscape to be able to ask what kind of prescribed burning it can be maybe necessary in our relational spaces, in our organizational spaces. What is underbrush that is healthy to clear through good or healthy conflict compared to overly suppressing it and then having it blow up to the point that by that time it's overly intensive and destructive. Um, and at which point we're asking different questions and we're more concerned about firefighting our way out rather than land stewarding our way forward. Right? So those are the components that I really think about. So I approach this in terms of a lot of how nature speaks and how the language of ecology and conservation allows me to be able to pause and reflect on how we tend to our social relationships, which are critical to a lot of the work of equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice-oriented work. And then so I'll close with these reminders that for me, it's still grounded in community. This is just a beautiful scene down in Juarez, right across from El Paso, which is interesting because as you all know, El Paso, because as you know, all know El Paso um, and Juarez is just like that component of being able to acknowledge that it's one community, right? And it's been always one community. And the way that we can think about borders can be differently as we do in the ecological system, as well as being able to approach this in our social ones. So with that, I will pause and say thank you, and I'll turn it over for some questions.
Thank you very much, Jose. Really appreciate that. So definitely want to remind folks to put your questions into the chat or the Q&A so that we can. Okay, I think I was muted. Now I'm unmuted. Let's try that again. So thank you so much, Jose, for that was a wonderful wonderful presentation. And there's a lot to discuss with these topics. They bring up a lot of emotions and a lot of, just different challenging, things that we have to talk about and deal with. And so I really appreciate your perspectives, sharing that with us today, and also just had no idea we shared a love of karaoke, so that is just wonderful. But I do want to start getting to some of these questions. Yesterday we actually had a roundtable discussion on diversity and equity, inclusion, and conservation space with some local leaders here and just some of our attendees. We talked about the importance of language, so thanks for addressing that a little bit. And can you speak a little bit more to sort of how that the language is important? Someone's saying here that the term conservation can actually be a triggering term. What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's important to acknowledge, as you mentioned, the discomfort, right, that can be felt through this in many different ways. And I think how I approach this sometimes with the sense of many of us that undertake like physical fitness goals. Maybe you're saying like, oh, I'm going to hit the gym for weightlifting, or I'm going to like take up running to run a marathon. Pick your exercise. That is putting your body in a physical state of discomfort. You often don't get up and say, great, time to put my body in a physical state of discomfort. You're like, time to hit the gym, time to like go for my run. And so acknowledging that supported discomfort and growth oriented discomfort is that it is a direction of growth for increased strength, and it requires planning and action and support, but it's still there. And so ensuring that we often don't confuse that with safety, because sometimes people might say, oh, this doesn't feel good, so I'm unsafe, therefore I step out, rather than acknowledging I'm uncomfortable because I'm facing some things that I had been comfortable for a long time, I've never questioned. And so I frame that because a lot of these terms, right, you might say conservation. What do you mean? What's wrong with conservation? There's nothing wrong with it. I've been using it forever and I don't see a problem with it. That's an example of like pausing and being able to ask yourself reflection questions to say, is it given my positionality, because of my privilege, the power that I've held in terms of a position, in terms of an identity, that there are things I cannot see, that I don't see. And that doesn't mean it's you are automatically bad. It's just you have not had that lived experience. But if you stop and ask to be able to say, how can conservation be triggering for some? And how is that an invitation for me to like look at how we can do that differently? To me, that expands power. Um, Rather than seeing it as a zero sum or because one of the question
Mhm.
I often say is, what power are you willing to give up? Because otherwise, what power are you willing to hold on to, such that you may harm somebody else? So that's a thought for me,
Mhm.
and I think
Mhm.
that part of this is acknowledging that language will continue to evolve, and being open to the different ways in which we bring some of these new terms can be helpful.
Absolutely. Um, there's another question is about sort of acknowledging history and how suggestions for sort of how to make that history more visible or acknowledged in our outdoor spaces, and especially specifically speaking of Indigenous peoples and their relationship to land. And is that something that could be we could do more of? Would that be?
Yeah, I mean that's another great question, right? These are um, as an example of justice oriented work, right? This is a whole conversation around land back. And uh, there is the way in which you think about like, how do you give land back to a community that that it was stolen from? And if you're not there, if you're not able to be there, how do yourself set yourself up in such an orientation so that at minimum A, you don't perpetuate the same erasure and cultural genocide that a community has experienced, but then B, be able then to think about, right, to say then what at least keeps us around that alignment. So it can start by the mere act of acknowledgement and representation, hence why land acknowledgements can be an important tool, but they have to be part of a goal and strategy. Just saying them, you always
Mhm.
have to be cautious that they default to being a checklist item. And so that can start. And then as well, think about what kind of decision making ability do we have to invite others into that type of decision making process. Um, because I think that's an example of moving beyond continuing to perpetuate erasure to then include in decision making community, and then moving forward, what are the opportunities to be able to restore stewardship, if not also co-ownership or ownership of that.
Yesterday, in our session, our roundtable, we talked little bit about sort of as our conservation community is trying to figure out how do we engage in this work, what are the next steps, and they're different for everybody and every organization and every situation, but that a key component is like sort of finding the why first, like that is sort of an essential part of recognizing why we're trying to do this work. It's kind of it's it, it's a there's a lot of this discussion happening around a lot of different sectors of our society, but in the conservation community. But that in order for it to really have a lasting kind of impact, we need to figure out the why, so that there's a long term, tangible sort of goal with that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? It again, as an example of like looking at how we hold space for the land. I've often said that there was an example in which we were working with an urban greening uh, community and an organization, and we said, how often do you all plant trees and then go out there every day and like say, hurry up, grow, like come on, it's been a day, so where are you now? We hold that space and intention, right, for that type of mid to long term growth. um, at the same time, we don't just like drop a bunch of green sticks on the land and call it a forest.
Hmm.
So to me, that's important, understanding how some of the community engagement, community building, community repowering work is important. Because if we're able to be this patient and intentional and caring with the land, I often ask, how are we transferring that with the communities for whom it is important that they also we're supporting how they see themselves invested in the same way that we do.
Yeah, and that gets sort of also to think to your point earlier about how the value, how is that value of inclusion in those spaces communicated, and how are we communicating that in our work? Someone's asking a question about your thoughts on the importance of having sort of our boards and our staff members reflect the communities that we serve and live in.
Mhm. That's a good question. I probably at this point sit on one too many boards, and that's, again, you hear me talk a lot about challenges and opportunities. The challenges is that it takes a lot of time, right? And so we always have to be cautious about when you approach someone to really have that conversation and hear it out, because you want to really try to ensure that you're providing the space for questions that come up around tokenism, the questions that come up around being extractive, to questions that come like, why exactly are you asking me? And let's kind of be honest and transparent around that.
Hmm.
And then second, that once you have board members, especially board members that are racially and ethnically diverse, as an example, is to understand that that can be a tiring uh, experience, different than other board members. There can be a different emotional labor, and so that, along with if you have asked somebody to kind of quote unquote engage in the diversity conversation, that has a lot of value, and often we think that just should come in as like an easy, free kind of component. And we're like, well, no, if that is why you've asked someone, then you need to hold space for that expertise. Because
Hmm.
if they're feeling undervalued and undermined when they're trying to bring in these conversations, that reinforces the idea um, that they're just kind of there to be in this space, but not actually being invited to help change the space.
So I know someone's asking about what organizations are out there similar to Latino Outdoors that we can start to reach out to and learn more about, partner with. But Latino Outdoors is actually in Texas, so we have Latino Outdoors people in Texas. In fact, there's a couple of them attending the conference, and I know that I plan to do some outreach to those folks to do just that and figure out how we can maybe do some more outreach and community partnerships and find those connections where they might exist.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I, I was waiting for that because I think I did not want to miss an opportunity to give a shout out to the Latino Outdoors team in Texas, especially in the San Antonio and Austin area. They have been one of the most amazing dynamic teams. And I think that if you're really looking for a model of what it means to be community based and volunteer powered, in terms of really tapping into that passion, concern, and conservation ethic, it's there. So of course, if you're in that area, I encourage you to reach out to them and being able to engage. They're also connected to a community of other community-based organizations that include both Latinx and non-Latinx based. So like Black Outside is another example of a type of a series of groups that are important in that area. Um, just across the border from Texas over in New Mexico, of course, also our friends Nuestra Tierra. And even though they are in New Mexico, they're not limited to New Mexico. So I would reach out to them as well, Nuestra Tierra Conservation Project. So those are examples. And then lastly, I think that there is a way in which I know you can simply, quote unquote, Google and then be
Hmm.
able to find organizations like Outdoor Afro or Outdoor Asian and other such representative groups. But I
Hmm.
would definitely not be afraid to start by reaching out to the local Latino Outdoors group there.
Great. Next question is if you can recommend approaches to finding out how to learn more about a community's needs and desires and plans so that organizations can determine if there's partnership opportunities or how they can best engage in that from
Yeah,
from the community's perspective.
great question. There's, I'll say 2 to 3 things, right? The first one is there is a lot of frameworks that you can approach this so that you have a plan of sorts, and that, for example, is based on participatory design. the work. A lot of this is often used, right, in building like urban or community parks, because you really have a process where being able to get all this information and inviting engagement across the whole process rather than just at the end, when often people say, all right, we made a park, so now let's let the community know it's here, and have them come and enjoy it. And like, why were they not invited at the very beginning when we were even just talking about the design of the park? And even before that, about the need for a park. So that's an example in that way. The second is really that there's still the power of invitation, that matters a lot. And at the power of invitation, though, you have to be able to ensure that as you're using that means the power of invitation doesn't mean the power of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like that you are impressing on them the way that you want them to engage. So it comes with that opening to be able to ask questions, hear what's being shared, and hear the concerns around why someone is not engaging. So that can start. That's why a lot of outdoor introductory activities, right? Visits to the land, a lot of and a lot of good old conservation policy work. There's that expression that the resource speaks for itself. So there's a value of that. But it still ends up, I'll close that part by saying that even a lot of the early Latino outdoors work was thinking about some of those basic questions, which is, what is it? Right? Like, what are we talking about? Because a family would ask, where are we going? Like, well, what is this place? Right? Second is, how do we get there? Because if we've never been there, we don't want to get lost. We want to like have a sense of knowing how to get there, even if it's a really close place. And then what do we do? The what do we do is also important because it invites that ability to really talk about what this landscape is for. And we're avoiding some of those presumptions. We would have groups say, oh, but we don't have a soccer field out there. I'm like, well, again, while a community may want a soccer field, you're presuming that that's what they want in all of these spaces. And you'd be surprised at how many of them simply appreciate why a preserve exists. But they've often had to face the question of is this for them? We had a family kind of say, thank you for bringing us to your park. I'm like, well, no, this is a public park. That means that you have a sense of responsibility and ownership this as well. So it's those little frames that we often have to work with and against.
Absolutely. So someone's asking about wondering if anyone has researched the like sort of the genealogy of lands they hold, and how that we as a community can honor the people who were displaced, and if you, Jose, have any input on how to sort of go beyond band-aid fixes, or kind of glossing over that to a more deeper, I guess, acknowledgement. And
that's a good question. Again, I say this with the directness because I think it's important to acknowledge that this is part of the conversation, and I acknowledge that it's not as easy. But for example, if you can give land back, give land back. And when I say that, right, I know like it brings up all kinds of things about ownership. But I say that in terms of like, right, what those questions mean in terms of land held in trust by a lot of groups here. And that can also just mean how is our decision making open? What is within our power? There's a question to say, what have we inherited that no longer serves us? And what that invites us is to be able to say, what are things that we do because legally there's really no way around it? What are things we do because we have explored and really see little to no other options? And what are things we do just because we've always done them and we haven't really questioned why we always do them in this way, right? That can sometimes open up a lot of space. And then in terms of the lands, it's layered. So much of the West, Texas is a particular example that so much is held in private, right, in private ownership compared to other states in terms of having public lands, and that it acknowledges that I, for example, as a Latino, have this layered identity of like colonizer and colonized. So many of the lands of my community in heritage there, which were like land grants, were also taken away, which themselves had been, possessed by taking them away from Native communities. So all of that is, we often say it's okay to invite the complexity or the
Mm-hmm.
messiness of it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because in conflict negotiation work, that allows us to really ensure that we're talking rather than resorting to binary caricatures of each other that affirms that, well, I'm the good person, therefore you're the bad person. I'm like, well, then, it's that question of saying, well, if they're thinking the same, then that's not really opening the space for dialogue and being able to engage in some of the needed and hard conversation and work.
Mm-hmm. So someone else is pointing, they enjoyed your comments on sort of the Disney World, the amusement park analogy, and that how do we better sort of introduce the value of conservation into community, and showcasing the value of experience, those nature experiences with
Yeah.
diverse communities, and communicating that and making that safe space.
I think, that last comment you just made about making it safe, right? To unpack what safety means differently for some of us. Just because so it's an example, right? It's an example of safety around gender. So I have a goal of running every day this year. I'm actually in my third year doing this, and so I actually been able to accomplish part of this goal in Texas over the past 2 years. And what that has meant is that I get excited because I can run in new places. And then sometimes I don't get up early enough, so I run later in the day or in the evenings. And as a male, the way that I run in some of these places, the way that I run through some parks, is very different than if I was a woman, right? If I was a woman, I would have a different safety decision making process about some of the places which I would run, at what times of day, and who's there. And so that to me, then, right, it's an unpacking that to be able to say, um, how do I think and consider that? Not, you know, not because then I myself saying, well, I feel safe, so what's the problem? But be able to say, if I care about how these places are supportive for others and I'm in relationship and working on this together, at minimum, I have to be open to listening to what that looks like and then what we can do about it. Um, and so that extends really, that's what when we talk about a lot of these words about power, privilege, and positionality, not to over intellectualize them, it's important to understand the context of why they exist, but then also the fact that these are real experiences for people. And if we ignore them, then what we're really saying is, I don't care about the way that you move in the world, that needs to be supported.
I agree. Yeah, thank you. Last question that we have here coming in from our attendees is, how do we? They're asking about collecting
Mhm.
demographic information to making sure that we are kind of representing our community, but to get away, I mean, really, like, how I think they're trying to get at, how do we figure out who our community is, and get past the tokenizing, and ensure that we are really serving that full community, and even just communicating what we do, and making sure, like you said, that it's inclusive of those
Mhm.
needs.
Yeah, it's a second question in this is we often ask is in service of what? So when we ask that question, what comes out? And if we want to collect demographic data, then we say in service of what?
Right.
If it's just to know, then that's like, okay, is that it? Is that good enough? Um, Part of, as an example of the U.S. Census, there is a fair critique as to be able to say, why do we have so many categories? Why don't we need to be able to classify ourselves in all this way? I'm like, it's a great point. If we all were just quote unquote Americans in this way, then that's all we need. However, we also have acknowledged the reality of social inequities, right? We have acknowledged the fact that we have these ideals, which are fantastic, right? To think that in this country, we really are stressing the point to say, this is how we want everyone to be equal. And we're not there. It's been an ongoing project. There's in to be able to strive for that equality, we have to account for equity. And equity acknowledges that we've had different starting points. And if we care about acknowledging that and supporting that work, then it means being able to say, huh, there is some of this data is important and helpful to understand what are those different starting points, what are those holes that we've dug communities into to help them get out of there so that they can access the same thing that we are able to access without thinking about it. And to me, that's kind of the nuance work, because if we don't approach that well, we default into some of these conflict oriented frames that say, oh, well, that's just a quota, or oh, that's like reverse discrimination. Oh, well, then that's not fair because we should all be getting the same. And I'm like,
Mhm.
it's a yes and. It's
Mhm.
both being able to say, I'm willing to make the commitment to say that um, what I know that I can access based on my gender, as an example, I want that accessible to everybody. What I can access in terms of my ability, that I can move in the world, enter buildings, have physical ability. I would love others to be able to experience those some things without having that concern. So to me, that's kind of the thought of the work. And so with demographics, it opens up being able to say, if I want to collect this data, why? Be clear and transparent with the community around it, because they may also have concerns around why are you collecting this and what are you going to do with it, and then be able to engage in that decision making process to be able to show, look, um, rather than thinking that sometimes some of these numbers we use them to say, let's ensure that we have everybody in this box, we're able to say, have we set up such a process that it is open to everybody so that it shows how we can meet these boxes, so to speak, rather than approaching it from the other way and then being able to go like, well, then let's go find people these
Mhm.
boxes.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
by doing that, you're paying attention to how the space has needed to change for that to happen. Otherwise, you're just inviting people into a space that isn't designed for them. Dr. Carolyn Finney says, a lot of these, as a Black woman, a lot of these spaces weren't designed with me in mind. So, what does that mean if we now approach this by using some of this data to redesign some of these spaces with that in mind, both physical and social and cultural and organizational spaces?
Absolutely. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here. I really enjoyed your talk with us today, Jose, and I loved something you said earlier, the idea of sort of, that this is the idea of sort of a healthy succession
Mhm.
for our community relationships. And, this is an ongoing effort for us to sort of steward, using the language of conservation, for us to steward a path forward, to, to continue this dialogue and continue these efforts. This is not a one, time opportunity. And I think as a society, we're all sort of um, trying to listen and learn and experience and share experiences and come from a place where we can work together to do good things. And
Mhm.
so, anyway, I just really want to thank you for being here. If you have any closing thoughts, we'd love
Yeah.
to hear them.
I would say two things. The first one is thank you all for the work that you do. Um, it's important to acknowledge again that you do this work out of a place of care and passion and concern, and I would say love. And I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, because I'm sure you could be doing many other things, but you're doing this obviously for the health of the landscape. And that then for me that's an invitation to be able to say we need all of you. And often when we talk about equity, inclusion, diversity, justice, access, and those types of frameworks, that we all may come at different experiences, and some of you may have had negative experiences with that. But I challenge you, in the best sense of the word, to acknowledge that we have the opportunity um, to really redefine the future. And if you're all familiar with redlining maps, right? Like these are maps that existed that really showed visually the segregation of housing, especially for Black Americans. And that's a reminder that those weren't all personal choices. It wasn't Black families saying, "Oh, I'm just going to choose to live over here." That's what we talk about, the combination of like implicit cognitive bias working with systemic resources and inequities. And so if I look at those maps, I want to say, do I want those? If I can I see those maps now? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. You can see those represented in access to green space, in health, and a lot of other things. I want the opportunity that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, I want those maps to look different. So I ask myself and think about what are we doing now to change those maps for the future? And that how we're protecting and conserving land is the same. And you play such an important role in that. So I ask you to continue. I'm excited by it. Good luck. And I know you'll continue the best you can.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope you guys watching today enjoyed that as much as I did personally. And I really do. Again, Jose, I just really appreciate your communication, style, and the way you talk about these issues. I feel it's just really great. And I'm just honored to have you join us today. So thank you so much for being here. I will just close by saying, these are important issues that I think, in our demographics here in Texas, they're changing, and our community does need to be, I think, more representative of our greater Texas community. And I'm really looking forward to working with everybody to help us move forward and steward those relationships. So again, thank you so much, Jose.
Gracias y para adelante, siempre para adelante.
Muchas gracias a usted. Bueno, gracias. Okay, now I just want to say y'all can head back to the main conference page to select your next room. We have one breakout session this morning, legal issues and I believe wildlife themed. So choose your session, and then we'll have our closing session back all together in room A. For our final two events of the conference. Thanks so much to everybody for being here, and see you again soon.